This meeting is being recorded. All right, fantastic. Hi everyone. Thank you again for joining tonight's Race History and Rock Creek program. My name is Tony Richardson, and I recently joined the Conservancy as the Senior Manager of Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, or JEDI. It's an awesome acronym, JEDI Initiatives. I'm born and raised in Washington, D.C., and I've been exploring Rock Creek Park since I was a kid. So I'm very excited to be working for a park that I care so much about. Um, in my role as Senior Manager of JEDI Initiatives, I will be leading the Conservancy's Race History and Rock Creek programming moving forward. The history of our national parks and Rock Creek Park in particular, as it sits at our nation's capital, encompasses people of all races and all walks of life. The National Park Service and the Rock Creek Conservancy have partnered to tell stories from the intersection of race, history, and Rock Creek through this ongoing series of programming. If you enjoyed tonight's event, please consider joining us for future events this fall. We're going to have one in October as well as one in November, and you can find that information on the Race History and Rock Creek landing page on our website. Tonight's event is titled Segregation in Rock Creek Park. We will hear from local experts as we explore the nuances of how communities have changed over time and discuss the work that lies ahead. It is my honor to introduce Kim Elder, Program Manager for Civil War Defenses of Washington with the National Park Service. Kim is a second generation native Washingtonian who loves the work of sharing history with those living and visiting the Washington, D.C. area. June 2022 marks Kim's 35th year as a federal employee. Her entire tenure has been with the National Park Service, and she looks forward to many more years of discovering and sharing. And with that, please take it away, Kim.
Good evening, and again, hello everyone, and welcome, Tony. I'm looking forward to working with you. We've been doing some great work with Rock Creek Conservancy, specifically around race and history in and around Rock Creek Park, and so it is my pleasure to join you all once again. Many of you are recognizing names and seeing faces that are very familiar, who've been a part of the series since we got started back in early 2021. So again, thank you all for joining us. It is my pleasure to be with you. As Tony noted, tonight's topic is segregation. I'm going to twist it up just a little bit. Segregation in and around Rock Creek Park and nearby vicinities. Rock Creek Park, as many of you all know, has served as a dividing line in Washington, D.C., separating primarily whiter, wealthier communities on the west side from the lower income communities of color and other persons of marginal on the east side. Discrepancies in equity of access to park spaces and trails exist between the east and the west sides. These differences have been the result of decades, literally decades, and even in some instances, some would say centuries, of city planning decisions, redlining efforts, displacement of various marginalized communities, and much more. The discussion tonight will explain how the division of communities on the east and west sides of the park came to be, and how these processes contributed to inequitable access to our public lands. Steps being taken to address the legacies of these injustices will also be noted in this discussion. So we're just not going to talk about the problem. We want to talk about how we can continue to correct it, how we can continue to recognize it. And then we want to hear from you as well as to how you think so. So as Tony noted, we're going to be looking for questions from you in the chat. And if you've got solutions or you know of things that are working in other areas that you want to add on, we look forward to your input. This is a very interactive and engaging conversation tonight. So we know that you're going to enjoy it. And we know that because we've got two great panelists joining us tonight to talk about much of this history. They both come well engaged, well educated, well versed in these subject matters. The first panelist tonight is Mr. Dan Reed. Dan is the Regional Policy Director at Greater Washington. In this role, Dan and his colleagues focused on housing and land use policy in Maryland and Northern Virginia. For a decade prior, Dan was a transportation planner working with communities all over North America to make their streets safer, enjoyable, and equitable. He is also an urban planner and trained architect. From Michigan to Florida, he's found innovative ways to make places safer, more vibrant, and more economically productive. His writings have appeared in publications including The Washingtonian, City Lab, and Shelter Force, as well as Just Up the Pipe, a neighborhood blog founded in 2006. Dan lives in Silver Spring with his fur baby, I'm assuming, Drizzy, the goodest dog in all of the world. Thanks, Dan, for joining us, and we're looking forward to hearing more from you tonight. We also have joining us tonight, Sarah Schofield. Sarah is a public historian and independent scholar specializing in DC history. She is interested in the city's historically racialized housing landscape and planning regime and the intersection of race and historic preservation. Working for Black Side, the film company best known for Eyes on the Prize, how many of us remember that? America in Civil Rights Years, and for the WGBH TV and other Black film projects. Influenced the trajectory of Sarah's work following the completion of her MA in history from Northeastern University. After moving back to DC in 2000, Sarah has been a historian for the National Archives and the Smithsonian Institute for projects such as A Voice, America I Am, the African Americans imprint, as well as several DC neighborhood heritage trails. More recently, she has been focused on DC's history and civil rights organizing as a researcher or historian and a writer for exhibits, historic landmarks, nominations, and other projects. You're going to hear a lot about that tonight. Sarah also uses her work to advocate against the mass displacement and over-policing of DC residents, Black DC residents. So at this time, we're going to go get right into hearing from our panelists. We're going to hear from our panelists who are going to give us some brief presentations. Then we're going to have a discussion. We've got some questions. We've received questions in advance. We're going to share those questions with you and go through some of those questions. And then if time permits, you're going to again share your questions in the chat, and we're going to have some time to talk about those as well. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Dan Reed. You've heard his bio. Dan, we look forward to hearing from you, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much, Kim. I'm really excited to be here. Again, my name is Dan Reed. I'm the Regional Policy Director at Greater Washington. We look at the entire DC area, DC, Maryland, and Virginia. My work focuses mainly on Maryland and Montgomery County and Prince George's County. I grew up in Montgomery County. I live in Silver Spring now, and I have a lot of family who, when they first came to this country in the 70s, lived in like Petworth, Columbia Heights area. So Rock Creek Park has always been a presence in my life, but one that was always a little unclear how do you get to it, which is, I think, a good way to start talking today. I'm going to share my screen in a second now to make sure y'all can see it. All right, can you see it? Got a picture? Cool. All right. Normally, I do a show of hands to ask who here has seen or heard of the show The Wonder Years. Okay, cool. We got some hands. Every year I do this, there's fewer hands. For those who haven't seen it, The Wonder Years was a sitcom on ABC that ran from 1987 to 1993. It told the story of a fictional family called the Arnold family. It was not set in any particular location in the 60s, but it was based on the homes of its two co-creators. Neil Martins grew up in Long Island, New York. Carol Black grew up in Silver Spring. So I like to think of The Wonder Years as a sort of document of what it was like to live here in the middle of the 20th century. And it was, for some, a magical time, right? There was massive investment in public amenities to support all of the people who were moving to this area from other parts of the country and later other parts of the world. Things like highways, things like parks, things like schools, things like shopping centers for people to go and visit and shop and patronize. But as we are here today and we understand, they weren't available to everybody, right? Here we go. Not everybody could participate in these investments that were being made. And there were a couple of tools that were used to ensure that only certain people had access to the public investments that were being provided. And the way you could grant access to these things was through land, being able to be close to those things, and then you could control access to that land. One of those tools was racial covenants. This was a thing that would be in the contract when you bought or sold your home that said, literally, you could not sell your home to a Black person, a Middle Eastern person, a Jewish person, an Eastern European person, in some of the more exclusive neighborhoods, even a person who was not Protestant. And there was different language for this. And even though racial covenants were outlawed in 1948, much of the region that was built at that time was already covered by that. So there was this pattern that was being set into place that certain neighborhoods were only accessible to white people. And this is a huge selling point if you were to buy a home in one of these communities, right? It was explicit. These are ads from the 1930s and 40s talking about like these neighborhoods are explicitly discriminatory and you can choose who you can live around. And they're also going to give you access to certain amenities in your community. This is a neighborhood on 16th Street in DC. This is a neighborhood in Kensington in Montgomery County. The second tool that was being used around this time was redlining. These were maps that were created after the Great Depression as the federal government figured out how to determine who could have access to government-backed mortgages. It is a little more complicated than just this map determined who got a mortgage, but what this map tells us is how these neighborhoods in the DC area were being ranked in the 1930s. The darker colored areas, which had grades like A, B, and C, were typically higher end majority white neighborhoods. The lighter colored neighborhoods like D and E and F were maybe more working class, more socioeconomically mixed. By the time you got down to the lightest colored neighborhoods, the H, those were neighborhoods where Black people lived. And you can see this pattern already from this map in 1936, in which Rock Creek Park runs up the middle of DC and into Montgomery County. And in general, everything to the west of it was white and affluent. And with some exceptions, everything to the east was not. And we're going to come back to this map because it is in many ways how this region is still spatially organized today. Redlining was outlawed as a tool by the 1970s, but again, this sort of pattern remains. The third tool, and this is a thing that's still in existence today, is zoning. This was originally created in the early 20th century, and it was many cities like Baltimore and Louisville actually had racial zoning. It would say this block is for white residents, this block is for Black residents, and you can't mix. In 1916, the NAACP, working in Louisville, Kentucky, found a white property owner who wanted to sell their land to a Black person. And when the city forbade this from happening, they sued, and the case went up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled in this case called Buchanan v. Warley that you could not have racial zoning. Fortunately, for people who wanted to make a segregation, on the other side of the country, Berkeley, California, a man wanted to keep a Chinese-owned laundry and a Black-owned dance hall out of his neighborhood. So he instituted what is called single-family zoning, saying that this neighborhood, you can only have single-family zones. And 10 years later, the Supreme Court ruled in Euclid v. Ambler that this was totally okay, that apartment buildings and more affordable homes were parasites on desirable neighborhoods, and you could totally keep them out. And so around this time, this is a 1924 map of zoning in DC. These are pretty standard land use colors. You can look at any other community and figure out what it says. The yellow areas are where the most restricted land uses are. These are typically neighborhoods where you could only build a single family house. These browner colors may have been more row houses or apartments. And then over here too, by the time you get to this stuff, this is just sort of everything else. We're gonna call it that. And you can see, again, here is Rock Creek Park running through the middle of the city. And there's this very clear divide that's formed between what kind of housing and what price of housing can exist on either side of the park. And this pattern continues to Montgomery County in a little bit of a different way, right? This is a modern zoning map of Montgomery County, and you can see the bulk of the land in the county is set aside for single family homes or agricultural areas. And then, oops, this stuff is where everything else gets to go, the apartment buildings, the shopping centers, and so forth. The difference here is that while this map isn't as explicit about using Rock Creek Park as a dividing line, we'll see how the park ends up becoming a tool anyway to divide communities, even in Montgomery County. So going back to all this, we've created a system in which certain people have access to certain neighborhoods that are more desirable. And even as the suburbs continue to grow, there were a lot of efforts to keep this pattern in place. Going back to the 1940s, there were community groups, this is the Montgomery County Civic Federation, still exists today, saying that they were upset about apartment buildings being built in communities like Silver Spring and that residents felt harassed by their presence in their community. And that is a dialogue that continues in many communities today. This is a picture of a protest, again, in Montgomery County from a couple of years ago, wherein residents are protesting affordable housing in their community. They're talking about a community in Bethesda, but it could be many communities in Montgomery County or even in DC. And the park comes up over and over again as a sort of way that people can use to keep others out. When the town of Chevy Chase was in their decades-long fight to block the Purple Line from being built, they paid for a study to look for tiny shrimp-like creatures, which they were convinced had to be in Rock Creek Park, and thus was a reason to not build this light rail project and to extend a trail that begins in Chevy Chase further east into Silver Spring. In DC, communities west of Rock Creek Park, which 100 years ago had been set aside for lower density and more expensive housing, community members were using those documents and those plans as an excuse for why there shouldn't be apartments or there shouldn't be affordable housing in their communities. And Rock Creek Park was explicitly defined as like, this, west of this, you cannot have these less exclusive things. So what does that look like, right? I work with a lot of maps in my work, so I tend to see everything in that sort of plane. This is that 1936 redlining map of Montgomery County in the tippy top of DZ, zoomed in to the top here. These areas on the left-hand side are the ones that were considered to be white and high-end in the 1930s. The areas on the right, less so. And you can see the squiggly here is Rock Creek Park. This is, did the map change yet? Where'd it go? This is that same map in color. This map is from the Montgomery County Planning Department, and you can see, this is why they call it redlining, the less desirable areas were red. Pay attention to these shapes, because this is the racial makeup of those same communities today, 80 years after the map was created. And those areas that were graded as white high-end neighborhoods in the 1930s are, by and large, still majority white today. The neighborhoods that were considered more working class or more working class white are more racially mixed. If you look at median household income, even today, those areas in the 1930s that were marked as higher end communities remain high income communities today. And it's so fine grained that even this section of Bethesda here, which was graded C, so slightly less high end, has even lower median household incomes than the A and B areas around it. This is a map of housing value. Again, there's this squiggle right here represents Rock Creek Park, and you can see on the west side where these were the higher end neighborhoods 80 years ago, they have dramatically higher housing values in areas to the east. And that map just keeps repeating itself over and over again. This is a map of white and Asian percentage of students in Montgomery County elementary schools. Here's Rock Creek Park running through the middle. And again, everything to the west, predominantly white and Asian. Everything to the east, predominantly Black, Hispanic, and multicultural. And because so many of these tools were used to keep non-white residents and non-white communities from having access to generational wealth, it also tracks with the percentage of students on free and reduced lunch. And you can see there's Rock Creek Park sort of forming the sort of vague boundary between the two. So what about the park itself? This is my last slide. I mentioned earlier that Rock Creek Park has always been a presence in my life. It's a place where I spend time. I learned to drive in the parking lot of Carter Barron Amphitheater. I've lived very close to the park for most of my life. Like right now, I live about a mile or 2 miles from the park in Silver Spring off Piney Ranch Road. And so when we had a prep call for this panel a couple of days ago, I thought, okay, well, let's look at how could I actually physically get to Rock Creek Park? And I realized I can't. If you look on the Silver Spring side of the park, there are a couple of trail connections here. I would probably have to drive to it. If you look at the western side of the park, the more affluent communities, there are lots of little connections into the park. If you're following my mouse here, there are streets that just sort of end and continue into the park. There's fairly small roads like Beach Drive that are easy to cross to enter the park. On the Silver Spring side, there is an industrial area and train tracks that form barriers. One thing you don't see on the map here is the Capitol Crescent Trail, which was right here. It's currently closed for construction for the Purple Line. And the trail as we know it basically ends, before you get to Silver Spring, right? Like it is a trail that connects to Rock Creek Park and for decades connected communities in Bethesda and Chevy Chase to Rock Creek Park. But if you lived in Silver Spring, you couldn't get to the trail, which means you couldn't get to the park. The Purple Line, when it is built eventually will continue that trail into Sulphur Spring, meaning for the first time, people on my side of the park will have an easy off-road, safe way to get into the park. And it seems like a no-brainer, but there are so many things that were set in place decades ago that resulted in the conditions that we see today. So that's my piece. I know I went fast, so I'm looking forward to the question and answer time afterwards.
Yeah, you went really, really fast, Danny. You've got some great maps, and I know we've got some great questions that come up in the chat, and people are thinking. And take your time. You've got some great information, great maps, great visuals. I'm sitting there like, wow. You know, I know that there are a lot of folks out there that still say, "Oh, this is not the case anymore. There's no more division. There's no more lines." But your maps are showing it. I mean, from the 30s to the present day now, and so. I know we've got lots of questions and feedback from your presentation. We're going to take the time to go through those as well, but we're going to hear from Sarah. She too has a equally fascinating presentation. Sarah, take your time, and again, we're going to make sure that folks know that there will be time for them to ask the questions. Put those questions in the chat box. So unlike me, you won't forget them. And then we can go back to it, making sure that we have this robust discussion that I know we're going to have this evening. Sarah? You're on mute, Sarah. You found your mute button? Tony, can we ensure that Sarah is still listed as a co-host so that she can unmute herself? If that, oh, there she is.
Got it.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, I had minimized my whole screen, so I couldn't find it anywhere. All right. Sorry about that. Thank you so much for inviting me tonight. And I want to start just with an acknowledgement that what's now Rat Creek Park and the rest of DC and Maryland was originally home to the Nakachank, who lived in this area on and off for thousands of years before being pushed out over the course of actually really just a few decades in the 1600s, by the 1690s. And their name, which was Latinized to Nacostan, was given to the Anacostia River. Their villages were primarily along the east bank of the Anacostia, but evidence of them remained throughout the city into the late 19th century. Especially in the form of tools carved from stone that came from what's now Rock Creek Park. So I'm gonna, I'm sorry if my presentation is a little bit repetitive because I also have a lot to, I do talk about racial covenants and the rise of segregation, sort of more DC focused during the first half of the 20th century, sort of as development moved beyond the city's original boundaries, including north of Florida Avenue in Northwest DC. And this map just shows the extension of streetcar lines. This is an 1891 map. So this is sort of as a representation of the city expanding, beginning around the turn of the 20th century. The dotted line is the Connecticut Avenue Rock Creek line, heading north west of Rock Creek Park. Prior to this time, white and Black people often lived in closer geographical proximity to one another than would be the case once new subdivisions were developed during the 20th century. So this is just an example of that in the area in Shaw, where the Black circles on the map represent Black households, and the white, the empty circles represent white households. So living in a somewhat segregated fashion, in that Black people were often living in the alley facing housing with white people living in street facing housing, but often much more close to each other, right? And this image from the 1930s exhibits that as well, with the disparate types of housing, but very close together. And that would change with the development of new exclusive whole subdivisions over the course of the first few decades of the 20th century. And so beyond the old city, again, Florida Avenue is sort of this curved road on the map here in the middle. Beyond the old city, Washington County was still mostly rural until the 20th century, and Black communities dotted the city's outskirts, especially in areas where Black refugees of slavery had first settled when they came to DC. And I think Kim Elder probably knows, can speak to that, the settlement, especially around the old Civil War forts that ringed the city. So remnants of these communities were still present in 1934 when this map was made, but these people would soon be pushed into the city, like into these more crowded, these neighborhoods where Black people were already living, such as Shaw, and also into sort of the most isolated sections of far northeast and southeast DC, so the least developed parts of the city. And again, these settlements often clustered around the former sites of Civil War forts, where Black people had settled during the Civil War. And this map that we created of showing the historic Black schools that ringed the city. They're all of the Black schools here are shown in blue. Indicates we've laid them onto a map of the forts, and they sort of serve as a representation of these Black communities that lived in these areas, such as Fort Slocum, Fort Stevens, Fort Totten. Many of these schools that existed for these Black communities were closed by the early 1920s as those communities were displaced from those areas. This is a digital version of that historic map from 1934, again, showing the remnants of these Black communities. This is Fort Stevens. This is, I believe, the Fort Reno area, Battery Kimball, Chain Bridge Road area here. Then you get the rise of racial covenants, not only contributing to the displacement of these communities, but then also forming barriers around areas where Black people already lived, preventing the expansion of Black settlement and causing overcrowding in the city's oldest housing. And of course, and again, causing, pushing people out to these most isolated sections of the city. And this is just sort of a close-up view of how covenants formed barriers around existing Black neighborhoods. This is Columbia Heights area. And this is on the west side of the map is Mount Pleasant, so just next to Rock Creek Park, which filled with covenants in the late 1920s. And so this displacement of Black residents, rise of racial covenants was really in keeping with this emerging science of real estate appraisal that tied the value of property to the racial makeup of an area. So this is an example of an actual real estate textbook from the period that said, property values have been sadly depreciated by having a single colored family settle down on a street occupied exclusively by white residents. So this idea sort of actually began emerging like in the 1900s as the field of real estate professionalized, and then when you have racial covenants being attached, as the exclusion of Black residents from a neighborhood as a feature of a neighborhood to make that neighborhood, it's the purpose. It really attached this idea of that the value of property or neighborhood had to do with the race of who lived there. And this is why even what was essentially a growing middle-class community of Black residents in Tenleytown was forced to vacate that area to make way for a new school and a park serving what was being developed as an exclusively white neighborhood. And this is one of the many parks created at these former Civil War fort sites in the 1920s, and in some cases where Black residents still had been living at that point. So the National Park Service then starts creating parks that are then serving, what are mostly white communities at this point. And if anyone has never seen a racially restrictive deed covenant, This is an example of a very early one from DC, written by a real estate company, Middle Shannon, that was one of the primary developers in the Bloomingdale neighborhood. They were, so I've highlighted the racial covenant here. They were the predecessor of a company called Shannon and Lux, which, if like me, you grew up in DC, you might remember Shannon and Lux, who developed or sold a lot of housing in Chevy Chase later. And I'll say that, if I can click back to the, that like most of the neighborhoods we've researched, of course, Bloomingdale and lots of, and what you're seeing here is all east of Rock Creek Park. I have other examples of sort of this is another neighborhood where covenants are used east of Rock Creek Park. And these are covenants being used east of the Anacostia River. Okay, so this wasn't, the use of these covenants wasn't exclusive to the neighborhoods west of the park. And this is a covenant used west of the park by a company called WC&A and Miller that's still active today. This one actually does not, in addition to barring African Americans, who are always barred with racial covenants, bars Jews, Armenians, Hebrews, Persians, and Syrians. And this covenant was still being used in 1958. That's when this deed is from. Oops. And these are a couple more examples of racial covenants being used west of Rock Creek, in neighborhoods west of Rock Creek Park. And what I want to note here is that in addition to racial covenants, or often in lieu of racial covenants, there were other types of covenants that, and this is what Dan was discussing, that kept neighborhoods exclusive. Housing had to cost a certain amount, in this case, any building on this lot had to cost a certain amount to build. Often you would see that the housing, any house on this lot has to be, a certain distance from the street. So that, meaning that the yard's going to be large. It has to be a single family detached dwelling, cannot be attached. So all of these kinds of restrictions, even when racial covenants were absent, contributed to the economic exclusivity of neighborhoods. And that's really what happened west of Rock Creek Park, is you get these covenants that are creating economic exclusivity. So for example, these are row houses in Bloomingdale. All of this housing had covenants, but they lacked some of the other restrictions that would keep neighborhoods west of the park mostly white. After covenants were no longer in use. Even these much more modest row homes near Howard University that had racial covenants when they were first built, but were Black occupied by the middle of the 20th century. So while you get movement of Black residents to neighborhoods well beyond where they were confined to in 1940. This is a map showing the racial distribution in 1940. This is 1970. West of the park remains almost entirely white. And then this leads to the issue of Rock Creek Park itself as a racial barrier. So in the 1930s, the Federal Housing Administration institutionalized the use of racial covenants in new developments as a criteria for federal financing. And so this is this is the language from the underwriting manual that was being used to advise people on how to evaluate property. But they also recognized, the FHA also recognized that natural barriers could serve the similar purpose of keeping neighborhoods exclusive. So certainly the developers of new housing west of Rock Creek Park recognized the park as a barrier to Black settlement. And I'll just read out what the Federal Housing Administration said about naturally or artificially established barriers will prove effective in protecting a neighborhood and the locations within it from adverse influences, which includes the prevention of the infiltration of business and industrial uses, lower class occupancy, and inharmonious racial groups. A location close to a public park or area of similar nature is usually well protected from infiltration of business and lower social occupancy coming from that direction. Hills and ravines and other peculiarities of topography often make encroachment of inharmonious uses so difficult, and on and on. So certainly there was a recognition of Rock Creek Park itself, or Rock Creek, I'll say, you know, before it was even developed as a park, you know, as one of these natural barriers. But it wouldn't have been an effective barrier without the other types of covenants that were in the deeds, you know, in housing west of Rock Creek Park, and then the restrictive zoning that came later, which essentially just locked into place the patterns that had already been set. So that is what really shaped that part of the city into this more expensive and exclusive area. But on the other hand, while zoning did bake into place those patterns west of the Rock Creek Park, east of the Anacostia River was rezoned, was upzoned in the 1960s as more and more Black residents were being pushed in that direction, especially during the urban renewal period. Those neighborhoods were actually upzoned to allow for filling, you know, much of that part of the city with apartments, and including in areas that remain quite isolated today from transit, from amenities, grocery stores, et cetera, filled with multi-unit apartment buildings. This is a color-coded version, another color-coded version of the map that Dan showed that was made by the FHA, you know, which graded neighborhoods in part based on their racial makeup. So again, almost all of the A-graded neighborhoods were west of the park, and we know that the others colored green were largely covered with racial covenants, and we mapped them in combination with the locations of where Black households were living in 1940. In as late as 2010, a version of this map still existed. This one was made by the DC Office of Planning, which notably calls the most white segregated neighborhoods west of the park stable. And while a lot of white people have moved east of Rock Creek Park, like especially over the past 20 years, even today, the area west of Rock Creek Park remains, you could say, stable in terms of racial demographics. In the 1960s, fair housing advocates encouraged Black residents to move west of the park, but were not very successful at the time. And this was before the Fair Housing Act of 1968 sort of really reduced the barriers to doing that. And so there were many reasons that people were not able to access housing west of the park if they were Black, but also some people weren't necessarily interested in accessing that housing. They just wanted good housing. And I'm going to stop here. I'm going to stop here. I don't have I just kind of wanted to lay out some context for this, and then we can talk more specifically maybe about Rock Creek Park during the Q&A.
So thank you, Sarah. You two shared a lot of light. We're going from one century to the next, and so I wanted to make sure we're very clear and that some of these legacies continue today. And so I'm just going to go right into the heart of some of our discussions this evening. How do these legacies and practices continue to impact communities today? I just want to jump right into it. I mean, I know that we have some other questions, and we're going to get to the questions that are in the chat, but I want to make sure that we know that this is an issue that we still must deal with today. And I'd love to hear from the both of you all on how these legacies of practice continue to impact communities in and around Rock Creek Park, up as far as for Dan, from you from the Montgomery County perspective, from you, Sarah, from the DC perspective. So I'm going to give Sarah a chance to rest her voice for a minute and go right to Dan for that question.
Sure. The legacy comes out in a lot of ways, right? I mean, for starters, the park is a big amenity, so communities that have direct access to the park benefit from that in terms of higher property values. And those neighborhoods tend to be on the western side of the park because of how the entrances are laid out. You know, all of the things that we've both talked about set this pattern into place wherein the most affluent and well-resourced neighborhoods were on the west side and then stayed that way, right? Because it was difficult for other people to access it. And we see that legacy today through literally just home values, school boundaries, school assignments, you know, demographic maps. Even the shorthand that we use, right? West of the park, east of the park. It wouldn't make a difference if they weren't so different from each other, or at least they weren't perceived to be so different from each other.
Sarah, you want to speak to it from the DC perspective, the DC side of how these legacies of practices continue even in impacting communities today, and even services that are provided in and around the park?
Right. I mean, one of the most significant legacies of exclusivity and barring Blacks from being able to live in a purchase property, especially, you know, is that the lack of the disparate accumulation of wealth. So I would say there's become like an overinvestment in the west side of the park, and there's an overaccumulation of wealth there as compared to, you know, maybe other parts of the city. And that is, contribute, you know, obviously it impacts where people are able to live today and what kind of, you know, what resources they have access to. And just sort of having such a limited, in terms of the park itself, so many, I think a lot of, I think it just continues to be an amenity that primarily serves residents west of Rock Creek Park.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm seeing, and I'm stepping out of my role, but I'm seeing some really great questions in the chat, and I want to make sure that we have time to address some of them. So Kathy M. asked the question, and Dennis can go to you first, and then Sarah. Kathy M., thank you for your question. How are these zoning decisions made? Did Black residents have any input into any of these decisions?
Sure, that's a great question. I kind of glossed over that, right? Zoning is a power that is given generally to local municipalities. So in DC, it would have been the originally, I think, the National Capital Planning Commission, and then the DC Zoning Commission. In Montgomery County, it was the Park and Planning Commission that was set up by the state of Maryland. So these are local governments that are setting zoning laws where things can go. At the time these decisions were made, Black residents may not have had any input in them. For a variety of reasons. To really, who can have access to power, who is able to testify at public hearings, who is heard and valued in that conversation. I know that sounds vague, right? But I think it is fair to say that they weren't given a lot of input, if any.
That's right. Sarah, do you want to add to that? Again, the question was.
Well, I'll just say that I know, certainly there were Black activists and civic association groups that did engage in conversations around zoning, and knew, they were certainly aware of what was going on and how zoning was displacing Black communities. But as Dan said, their voices weren't, they weren't the ones that were making the decisions or necessarily being listened to.
That's correct. And so let me just add also that on one of our very first Race and History series, we featured the book Chocolate City. And Chris Asher talks a great deal about the zoning and the efforts that African Americans were making to make sure their voices were heard, but they fell on deaf ears. So I hope we were able to answer that question for you, Kathy, and we'll have additional questions posed as well. I have another one, and that's how have these legacies impacted access? Dan, you talked about access from your own neighborhood today. We're not talking 40, 50 years ago. We're talking access to the park today. How have these legacies impacted access to the Rock Creek Park? And you talked about it more, but for maybe those who joined a little bit later, how these things are continuing to impact access. Let's talk about access for a little while.
Yeah. I think the example I used in the presentation was the Capitol Crescent Trail, or formerly the Georgetown Branch, which is today it is a trail that connects Georgetown to Chevy Chase and sort of ends a mile west of downtown Silver Spring, and it crosses Rock Creek Park, right? So for much of Montgomery County, the way you can get to Rock Creek Park is on this very nice, comfortable trail. The portion between Bethesda and Silver Spring is under construction right now because it's also part of the route for the Purple Line. It was historically a rail line that was converted to the trail with the anticipation it would be a transit line. And many of the communities on the west side of the park, like Bethesda and Chevy Chase, fought the construction of the Purple Line because they did not want to lose the trail or have the trail be more accessible. And so the result is, to this day, from the Silver Spring side of the park, there are fewer ways to access the park, and none, I think, as high quality as the Capitol Crescent Trail. When the Purple Line is finally built, the trail will be extended all the way into downtown Silver Spring, where it would intersect with, other sidewalks and trails and bike facilities, but also, a much more socioeconomically diverse set of neighborhoods than could have been able to access the park in the past, or the trail in the past. That's one thing. The other thing is, and I personally don't know as much about the history of why the access points are where they are, but if you look, many of the streets on the western side of the park in Montgomery County continue into the park or have paths going into the park, mostly because those neighborhoods are residential in nature. On the east side of the park, directly against the east side of the park in Montgomery County, is an industrial area, the Walter Reed Annex as well, and a historically Black neighborhood called Liddensville, much of which was redeveloped through urban renewal in the 1960s and 70s. So that all these things sort of together, none of them were really oriented towards the park, which meant everything around them in turn could not access the park. So it sort of compounded that.
So do you want to speak to access and how some of these legacies continue to impact access even today?
Yeah, I don't think I have a lot to add to that. Other than that there were historically, and I'm speaking back to like articles that were like from the 1930s about access being limited to the parks when they were technically legally supposed to be open to everybody, that like certain, there were only very few picnic grounds that could be permitted for Black people, like that, because that was how the people that were managing the permits and the local personnel that was managing federal space was doing that. And so I would say that is just one, like, that has contributed to that sort of lack of access and feeling like this is not Black space for so long. Contributes, there's like continues to be, I think, I would think like a psychological barrier, like a kind of like this is not, and there's also in spaces like I can't speak specifically to Rock Creek Park, but like Meridian Hill Park, Malcolm X Park, which was not really designed as a space for Black people. When Black people started hanging out there, they were very policed. And so there's, when there's this history of over-policing of Black people in what are considered white spaces. And I think that probably contributes to, I'm talking about more of like well, it probably contributes to, I think it remains a barrier today. I'll say that, yeah.
And so thank you so very much for that. I want to speak to, because we're seeing a couple of questions and comments in the chat. I want to make sure that we're engaging those comments, and we're definitely going to get to a lot of them. But we talked, from my perspective as an NPS employee, and a second generation ranger, a second generation native Washingtonian, whose mother was also a National Park Service ranger. I grew up over in Southeast, so well on the side of Anacostia, and I can speak to knowing the history that dates back well into the 19th century. The Honorable Frederick Douglass himself was met with a covenant when he purchased Cedar, when he attempted to purchase Cedar Hill. And so it's something, again, a very long standing, and we're seeing lots of changes happening, but again, these legacies continue on, in some cases very quietly, in some cases very overtly. So I wanted to just again go back to the chat, and someone inquired about Newland and the Chevy Chase area. Wanted to know if either of you all wanted to speak to the Chevy Chase area, and specifically Senator Newland and the whole idea of creating this area that was specifically, I mean, it was very open that this was an area, and that that's what they intended to do. They want to, either of you want to speak to that? Dan, I saw you nodding your head.
Oh, that nod was like, Sarah, you should go first.
Yeah, I mean, I could, there's some, Tim Hannapel is on here, and he can probably speak to that a lot more specifically than I can about Newlands. I mean, Newlands was a pretty overt racist, and he was the founder of the Chevy Chase Land Company. And I don't think that we have actually, I know that we haven't really found a lot of racial covenants in the Chevy Chase Land Company's holdings at the time that they first, owned the lots, but they certainly show up later. And I certainly think that Newlands would be an example of a developer who understood the benefit of Rock Creek Park as a barrier. I mean, he also actually had a known belief about about development happening on the west, that the east winds carried, nuisance odors and other things that you wanted a barrier to the east, and then development would proceed west. But again, like I haven't paid a lot of attention to Newlands, only because there are some other scholars like Neil Flanagan, for one, who's written about the history of Fort Reno, and I know Tim on here too. They've done a lot of work on the Chevy Chase history specifically.
So Laura Lipsy asks, can you speak to the role of the National Park Service in some of the displacement and racial segregation that occurred as a result of the conversion of Civil War forts into parks for enjoyment by surrounding new, mostly white development? Specifically, Sarah, you spoke of Fort Reno, and the displacement of many of that well-developed, well organized. I mean, they had everything. They were operating, and I'm speaking from just a historical perspective of the Civil War defenses. Fort Reno was a very well-to-do community of African Americans who were well educated. Most of them educated at Howard University. They had their own pharmacists. They had their own. They were able to literally operate within themselves there. And again, recognizing the whole issue of the value of that space, and working with the federal government and Melvin Hazen and so many others with the commission to literally displace. And we talked about displacing the Blacks and having them move east of the Anacostia River. And then it got to the point it was so crowded there, they were having to move out to, again, now at this point, now the suburbs of Prince George's County. So yes, the National Park Service played its part in that, in the shutting down of Reno City, but it was, again, the city primarily. And then the National Park Service came behind to develop what we now know as the Fort Reno Park, and the Reno schools and the school systems that are there. Did either of our speakers wanted to address any more about Fort Reno?
Not Fort Reno specifically, but I think, the question about sort of the development of the parks at those former Civil War sites, is an interesting question. I mean, it happened in the 1920s which is a period of pretty severe rise of segregation, and certainly it happened. Certainly there was pressure from growing, emerging, white exclusive neighborhoods to push these older Black communities out. And so and for example, I'm thinking about around Fort Totten. There was a Black community around Fort Totten, and I was able to look at the papers of the Citizens Association, the white exclusive Chilham Heights Citizens Association, and one of their big accomplishments of the year had been successfully lobbying the DC commissioners who were federally appointed, the people that ran DC, to strip out from the city's budget, the money to support a Black school that was in the neighborhood. So they were going to get a new school. Instead, the school got closed. And that's sort of, that's one of these schools that was serving this community, and that then disappears. And it happens then around the same time as the parks, as these sites like Fort Totten are being developed into parks to serve what are becoming exclusively white neighborhoods. So I definitely think there is a relationship, and I would love to know. I have poked into it a little bit, but I would love to know more.
Well, so this question was directly for you, and I'm going to Kathy M. ask this question as well. It says you should know that you're familiar with your project with the DC Oral History Project. She wants to know if you have an opportunity to speak to folks who lived through this zoning barrier, individual experiences. Could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so, and my project partner, Mara Chakaski, is here today too. We have interviewed a lot of people, specifically in what is the now Ward 4. So the east side, mostly east side of Rock Creek Park, from like Petworth on up, about the experience of really the barrier breaking experience of being like the first Black family on the block, the first, the people that integrated Roosevelt High School and other, school, Coolidge High School. So yes, we have talked to a lot of people who, both Black people who were, among the barrier breakers in these exclusively white neighborhoods. We've also talked to white people who grew up in neighborhoods like Petworth and Riggs Park, and whose families moved out, in 1959, 1960. And maybe we're like among the last white people on their block. So we've talked, I mean, it really gives you a good sense of sort of the micro history of these neighborhoods and the transitions that happened mostly in the 1950s.
And then thank you, sir. There were another example of a Montgomery County area that of the African Americans that were displaced. And I'm not sure if you could speak to that. I believe it was, they were talking about Grub Road and, well, actually Rosemary Hill and some of those other areas.
Yeah. I'm trying to find I read the comment and I was thinking about, oh no, where'd it go? Grub Road is a road that's sort of like the boundary between Sulphur Spring and Bethesda or Chevy Chase. That's where the zip codes are, and it is to this day, I think, the boundary for the school districts as well, I think. But it is close to an area called Littonsville, which was a historically Black settlement that dates to like the mid 19th century. Much of it was redeveloped as urban renewal in the 1960s and 70s for the industrial uses, and then there's like some garden apartments there as well. What happened after that in the 1980s is one of the county's first-ish attempts to integrate the elementary schools. They mentioned Rosemary Hills Elementary School. What the county started doing is they paired Rosemary Hills, which at the time was a very mixed elementary school, and North Chevy Chase, which is the school on the opposite side of Rock Creek Park, which is majority white, and they put them together. So for the past 40 years, students from those two schools, actually, they attend K through 2 all together at the one building, then go to 3 through 5 at the other building. And that was one of the things that was sort of done to maybe repair some of the decisions that were made in the past. The other thing I didn't mention is the Rosemary Hills neighborhood, which is next to Littonsville, was built in the mid-20th century and was explicitly off limits to Black residents, right? So it was next to Littonsville, it was adding housing next to Littonsville, and it was not available. There was an apartment complex called, what was it called? Oh my goodness, the name is now the Barrington, but it was something else before. That was also one of the first apartments to integrate in the area. Well, it might have been called Rosemary Hills Apartments before. I don't know. But that part of Montgomery County has, I think, a lot of stories about historical segregation and then attempts to address it later on. And that story is still in many ways being written.
Thank you very much. There was a question, I'm looking for it in the chat. That's where we've got folks who are doing that, and I shouldn't be doing that. But there was a question as it related to the unrest or the riots that took place at Glen Echo Park. And could either of you all recall any other sort of unrest that happened in the city, in the Washington, D.C. area? Any unrest? I know that Glen Echo Park, I'm very familiar with that history as well. With Montgomery County, any other instances in either Montgomery County and or DC that either of you all can speak to?
I have this this article from 1930 about the protest by the NAACP against the restriction of picnic spaces. This remained an issue a couple years later, we know, because there was a Black ministerial alliance, about 40 Black ministers that were, again, like bringing up the same issue, even though the parks were legally supposed to be open to everybody. They were not being managed that way, as were, was the story with many federally owned sites in the district, recreation sites, and it was sort of not even known necessarily what the policy was until around 1940, in the aftermath of the Marian Anderson concert at the Lincoln Memorial, and the Secretary of Interior really making a statement at that time. That was sort of when it really became a more formalized policy, I'll say. But even then, even for over a decade, more than a decade, I guess a decade after that, you've got the management of places like Anacostia Pool, for example, and other federal sites. The concessionaires and the local people that are managing those spaces and Anacostia Pool is a good example of a place where there was very significant unrest. Also, Rosedale Park was another place where there was a lot of picketing going on, especially after a Black boy climbed the fence to get into the pool and drowned. Yeah, there was a lot of unrest, a lot of protest of these policies.
Okay, so then just to add a sidebar, Sarah, could you share ways in which segregation was implemented within Rock Creek Park? There was a short period under the Wilson administration where there required choices used to sort of exclude Blacks. I mean, we're talking again, the Wilson administration. Do you want to talk about the ways in which segregation continued even beyond? I mean, we just talked about these unrest in these areas, but specifically in Rock Creek Park. And you did,
right.
You did answer that really. You answered it really good with the examples with the picnic grove areas.
Right. That was, yeah. I mean, that's sort of all the specifics I have about that question about how the quiet ways in which Rock Creek Park was being managed in an exclusive manner. Yeah.
All right, Tony, I'm gonna ask if you could take a look at the chat box and come up with another question or two for our panelists. I know Kathy's got a follow-up. Kathy Emma's got a follow-up, and she's asking what enabled the change so that folks of color were able to purchase homes when they wanted to. Ida, if you want to speak to that while Tony continues to look for any other questions that we could possibly take a moment to answer.
Yes. So I talked about a couple of the things that were used to keep Black people from buying homes, like racial covenants and redlining. But when the racial covenants were outlawed in the 40s, redlining was outlawed in the 70s as a basically the Community Reinvestment Act, which was mortgage companies were banned from discriminating against people by race. The big thing that made it easier for non-white people to buy homes was the Fair Housing Act, which was passed in 1968 and then amended and added on to in the 1980s. It eliminated, on paper at least, a lot of the things that people could use to discriminate in housing, right? And it went further than just race. In the 50s and 60s, apartment buildings would say you couldn't have kids, for instance. So that was made illegal by Fair Housing Act too, and there were all the protected classes: race, sex, familial status. Disability was added in 1988. Some communities add additional protected classes. In DC, you can't discriminate based on political affiliation or source of income, or sexual orientation or gender identity. That was the big thing, and it was a huge controversy in the 1960s. I wrote a piece for Shelter Force a year or two ago about how the California Association of Realtors led a fight to block the Fair Housing Act from being passed in that state. It passed in, I think, 67 or 66. And then for 20 years after the Fair Housing Act, realtors associations continued to fight attempts to, or downplay attempts to create more integrated housing. So it wasn't until the 80s that that effort actually stopped. And the reason I'm saying that is to say that, these little steps that were made to open up housing to everybody, it wasn't just like a light switch went off, right? I said that mortgage companies were banned from discriminating by race in 1977, but we saw in the mortgage crisis and then in the housing boom, housing bust in 2008, the way that mortgage companies were using we're basically pushing inferior products like subprime loans to Black and Hispanic homebuyers. So these are the things that have happened, but there's still more to do.
Sarah, would you like to add anything to that? Of what caused the change?
Oh, what caused the change?
The change. What are some of the things that happened that changed some of the mindsets and the covenants and the release of the covenants and the reduction of the, a lot of them were simply the law, they were made illegal, but did you want to speak to anything else in regards to the change? What kind of things were happening that were causing these changes other than law? There were other things that were impacting as well, I believe.
Right. Well, in the district, as we saw, there wasn't particularly a lot of change west of Rock Creek Park in terms of who lived there, but certainly Black people moved to other neighborhoods that had been totally off limits to them, all over the rest of the city. DC always had quite a significant Black middle class that could afford decent housing if they were only allowed to access it. And so as soon as they were, they did. But and a lot of that housing became available to them because whites were leaving the city en masse. And there was an enormous pressure by the real estate industry to facilitate that. But we're left with this enormous disparity in wealth accumulation that resulting from Black people being unable to access the real estate market for such a long time. So by the time you get the Fair Housing Act, the passage of the Fair Housing Act, a lot of people can't take advantage of of the ability to move into neighborhoods where they had been excluded from before because, real estate has been the primary means of wealth building in this country. If you didn't have access to real estate, it made it very, very difficult to really to be able to access the new, to new housing.
Yes, and both of you all spoke to the whole idea of lack of ownership. The lack of the intergenerational wealth. They just go hand in hand. And so you both spoke to that very well in your presentations as well as in subsequent discussions that we had. I see a sort of a question from Wanda Gabriel. With the current closure of Beach Drive, Rock Creek Park is perpetuating the lack of access east of the park. Is Beach Drive planned to reopen? So let me just note this, Wanda, that the comment period for comments for Beach Drive just recently closed, and I believe that those comments are being reviewed. So there's no decision to be announced at this present time. That's all I can note to you at this present time. But the comment period did close. We were in receipt of hundreds, I believe thousands of comments. And that decision as to what will happen with Beach Drive has not yet been made public yet. I hope that answered your question, or at least gave you enough status to know that something is coming, Wanda. Can I get a thumbs up if you are with that one, Wanda? Gabriel, I see you. Okay, thanks, Wanda. All right, Tony, you have anything else in the question chat box that we should be addressing?
Sure. So it looks like one just came in from Tim. He said, Dan, you've written quite a bit for GGW and other outlets about the push for affordable housing as a current day flashpoint for some of the other issues of racial and economic exclusivity. Can you comment on the shortening of affordable houses and what you're seeing in that arena?
Yes. So all the things that we've discussed have created this pattern, right, of exclusion and segregation in our communities, and people do fight to preserve them, not necessarily because they are carrying some kind of bigotry, but like people like where they live and may not want it to change. But the result is, we have this massive national housing shortage. I think I've seen estimates from anywhere from 3 to 6 million houses short. In the DC area, it's like over 100,000 homes that we are missing, in part because the population is growing, but also one of the consequences of the Great Recession and the housing bust is we're building considerably fewer houses. People left the construction industry, home builders failed, communities were approving less housing. So part of the reason we have dramatically rising home prices today is because we have a lack of homes. And part of why we have a lack of homes is because of, in many communities, zoning that restricts the ability to add more homes. And so attempts to provide new housing communities, in particular affordable housing, continue to be a flashpoint, right? In Chevy Chase, the Montgomery County part, there was a discussion earlier this year about replacing the Chevy Chase library on Connecticut Avenue with affordable housing above. And I know in the DC side of Chevy Chase, they've had this exact same conversation about their library. In Montgomery County, community members opposed putting affordable housing on top of a new library, and in fact, asked the county to not give them a new library so they wouldn't have to contend with affordable housing. And there was a really unpleasant rally in April that I attended, in which it was organized by a variety of groups that supported affordable housing at the library. There were speakers speaking in favor of it, and community members from Chevy Chase showed up with banners and yelled things like, "This will turn Chevy Chase into Anacostia." It was frankly embarrassing for my community to see that. And it may have backfired because it actually pushed the county to seriously reconsider affordable housing on top of the library. And that's just one example of the many fights that we see all over the region in DC and beyond, that whether we intend to or not, tend to dig up a lot of the legacy of the things that we've been talking about this evening.
Thank you so much. I want to make sure we only have a few more minutes left, and I want to make sure, as I said when I opened this up, that we wanted it to be inclusive and engaging. And now I have a question to you all, so take a moment to place your responses in the chat box. Our panelists will speak to it as well. How are we doing now? And the we is all of us, not just the National Park Service, not just the different counties and governments. How are we doing now? What more needs to be done both to rectify housing and community segregation, and how we can make the parks more inclusive despite these patterns and these legacies that these patterns have created over the many, many years. Again, we're now talking decades and decades. So I wanted to, let me just pose that one more time. How are we doing now? And what more needs to be done in both rectifying housing and community segregation, and how we can make the parks more inclusive despite these long legacy of patterns. So I'm gonna open it first to our panelists, and if we want to take a look at that chat box, we can maybe take a couple of your comments, responses to that question. We're gonna do that because we have just a little more time, but I want to make sure that we got you all engaged as well. Dan,
If I could quickly,
I'm sorry.
if I could quickly interject, Kim. So I just put that question in the chat, so everyone should be able to see it. We are asking this chat to everyone, all of the audience members, so feel free to respond to this question in the chat. And then while we are discussing this last question, I just wanted to ask, we've gotten a lot of requests to share Dan and Sarah's contact information. Is it okay if I put that in the chat?
Mm-hmm.
All right, excellent, thank you.
Okay. So Dan, you wanna start us off on how we can make this better? What are we doing, and how can we be more inclusive of all communities?
Sure, it's a big question, and there's no single answer. One of the things, not the only thing that we can do to address some of the issues of housing segregation is zoning. Who can live where and what we can build in what places. Sarah alluded to the ways in which the city zoned areas east of the river for apartments where it was more affordable, but it was also in the most isolated parts of the city where people could not access jobs and services and the things they need to live a good life. We should allow more apartments and more different types of homes in areas where we don't allow them today, because those areas are often some of the wealthiest and most well-resourced parts of our city and our region. That's one thing we can do. Another thing is improving access to the park, both physically, through safer streets that make it easier to walk and bike to the park, to enter the park. I alluded a little bit growing up that, living in Silver Spring and having family in Petworth, 16th Street was a huge barrier to getting in and out of the park. And in many ways, it didn't exist mentally as a result. Those are two of the things. There are many, many more things we could do, and I'm sure we're going to get lots of good answers in this conversation.
I'm hoping so as well. Thanks, Dan. Sarah, what can we do more of, and how can we correct some of these legacies?
I mean, I would say like a root cause of like maybe focus less on integration or desegregating neighborhoods, and just invest equally in all places, and invest in places where Black people already are living, and give them the amenities that they need. That nobody should have to move somewhere else to access like a good school or a grocery store. And if we equalize resources, we're going to be addressing, what people really want. People just want people just want that stuff. Like, yeah, and I think there's like, we are too reliant on, we're not we're reliant on the construction of market rate housing to get affordable housing. So we're never keeping up, right? Like, and so I guess I'm more interested in looking at housing policy and like the housing policy crisis versus the housing crisis. I think we'll never building affordable housing, given that we're relying on developers that need to make money to build, a certain percent of units that are affordable to a certain level of income, that often aren't people that need the housing most. That we need to look at other ways to provide people with housing and resources.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Dan. Tony, you want to take a few minutes to read a couple of the comments that we have received, the responses to that loaded question?
Yeah, definitely. So Brian Joyner said we need to acknowledge the past, review policies, and do better in the future. Ralph Douglas said we need to seriously work toward greater economic justice to increase, just skipped up for me, to increase economic power, overcoming what Sarah talked about, legacy hampering generational wealth and growth. Kathy M said, more park events, prioritize reopening the Carter Barron and get a variety of events going again. Love to hear that, Kathy. Shirley said, root causes of displacement and gentrification are real estate markets, kind of difficult to counterattack those forces. Affordable housing, housing trust, etc. can help. And then Lauren said, more reliable public transportation and continue to address crime so that specifically those underutilized parts that are in proximity to the communities that have traditionally been disenfranchised can be enjoyed without concern for personal safety, either to or from or at the parks. Thank you everyone for typing in really great ideas and really great discussion in the chat.
All right, so Tony, I'm going to turn over back to you with less than maybe 5 minutes to go. I know you wanted to have some closing remarks, and again, we want to thank everybody for joining us on this evening.
Yes, definitely. And I know there were a lot of folks asking for Sarah and Dan's contact information, so I just dropped that into the chat. And yeah, just wanted to thank you all again. You know, I want to say thank you to our moderator, Kim. Kim did a fantastic job. Thank you so much, Kim Elder, and to our panelists, Sarah Schofield and Dan Reed. Also, thank you to all of you for attending tonight and spending your evening with us. Again, this event was recorded, and everyone that registered for this event will automatically receive a link to that recording. Again, if you enjoyed yourself tonight, we encourage you, please consider joining us for future race history and Rock Creek programming. We will have an event in October as well as November. You can look up that information and register for those events on the Rock Creek Conservancy website. And please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or suggestions for future topics. We'll also be doing another series of race history in Rock Creek in spring of 2023. And just a final thank you for attending tonight's race history in Rock Creek. It was a really, really engaging and enlightening discussion. So thank you all, and thank you for all of the comments in the chat.
And again, thank you, Tony, and keep up the great work. We're looking forward to hearing more even exciting things coming out of from our Jedi. I love saying that. So again, thank you all. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Dan. You all brought a lot of great information. There's so much more. It's like an onion history. You got to unpeel it. Just keep unpeeling it. And these series are going to help us continue to unpeel it. So again, thank you all very much on behalf of the Rock Creek Conservancy and the National Park Service here at Rock Creek Park. We want to thank you all for spending the afternoon and the evening with us. Good night.
Thanks.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, Kim.
Good night, Brian. Thank you for joining us.
No problem. You guys did a great job.
Thanks for joining, Brian.
No problem. No problem whatsoever. Tony, this is your first one, right?
It is.
You did
It
a
is.
wonderful job. Ooh,
Nice,
he and Roman.
nice.
Yes, he did.
Great job. Did our panelists
Great.
leave us already?
Thank you. Thank you.
Did our panelists leave us, Tony? Maybe
They
we just
did.
need, they did. They both did. So maybe
Yeah,
we
both
can
of our
just
panelists.
do a real quick wrap up tomorrow or something another time just to see what their feelings were. But you all did a great job. I think everybody enjoyed it.
I didn't do anything. You guys did amazing. Kim, you are a natural at this. I was just watching and I was like, wow.
All righty. So give you guys get some sleep, and tomorrow's Friday.
That is
That's right. That's right. All right. Thanks again, Kim.
All right. And Tony, if you want to just wrap up again, we generally just wrap up with the panelists to see their thoughts or anything else. But I think tonight went very, very well.
Okay, sounds good. I'll send out an email first thing tomorrow morning and just see if folks want to get together for a quick meeting or just put some thoughts in, create an email thread. We'll see whatever's easiest. But yeah, I'll get that out first thing in the morning.
Great job, you two.
All right. Thanks
Good
again.
night. Bye-bye.
Good night.